Hi everyone, my name is Penny and I am a mixed methods researcher from Advanced HE. I am delighted to be presenting to this year's NADP annual conference on what does data tell us about disabled staff and students in UK higher education. In the next few slides, I will present you with some key findings related to disabled staff and students in higher education arising from Advanced HE's latest equality statistical reports. The latest reports are mainly based on HESA data from the 2019-2020 academic year, so just as a content warning, I realise that a lot of the language used by HESA, and thus our reports, when it comes to disabled staff and students, is more closely related to the medical model of disability. So I apologise in advance for that, but would like to clarify that the purpose for which we in Advanced HE use this language when analysing HESA data is to remain consistent and report along the lines of the categories used for data collection purposes. So let's start by looking at disclosure rates. The graph on this slide shows that within the last decade, both student and staff disability disclosure has nearly doubled. For students, the percentage of those disclosing a disability has risen from 8% in 2010-11 to 14.6%. For professional and support services staff, the percentage has risen from 3.6% to 6.5%, and for academic staff from 2.7% to 4.6%. As becomes clear, disability disclosure rates vary significantly between the different populations in UK higher education, with the amount of students disclosing as disabled being almost twice that of staff. The proportion of academic staff members disclosing as disabled keeps on being the lowest of all compared to students and professional and support staff, and I hope that throughout this conference we will question and explore why this might be the case. Disability disclosure rates vary across students in different degree levels as well. Specifically, the higher up we move in degree levels, the lower the proportion of students disclosing a disability. The only exemption to this trend is between taught and research postgraduate students, where 11% of PhD students disclosed a disability, compared to just below 10% of master's students. 16.4% of first degree undergraduate students disclosed a disability, and 12.7% of students in other undergraduate degrees. Moreover, the student staff disability pipeline is telling, as the gap in the proportion of disability disclosure in each step of the way from first degree undergraduates to professors increases. The proportion of disabled first degree undergraduate students is 5 times bigger than the proportion of disabled professors. Specifically, as the graph in this slide shows, although almost 1 in 6 undergraduate students is disabled, only 1 in 30 professors is disabled. The next few slides focus on disability student allowance claims. Among disabled students with a known DSA status, 32.7% received disability students allowance in 2019-20, which represents a decrease of 1.3 percentage points compared to 2018-19, and is almost 14 percentage points lower than the peak noted in 2009-2010. Disability allowance take-up varies significantly by students' impairment type, with students disclosing specific learning difficulties forming the biggest proportion of those in receipt of the allowance at 43.6%. Students disclosing a mental health condition are far behind in the second place, forming just above 18% of the recipients, with students declaring multiple conditions in the third place, forming 16% of the DSA recipients. Disability allowance take-up also varies across degree levels. The biggest proportion of the allowance recipients are first degree undergraduates, making up a third of the recipients, followed by master students who make up nearly a quarter of the recipients. Almost 22% of the DSA recipients are research postgraduate students, and nearly 16.5% of the recipients are students from other undergraduate degrees. Let's now focus on the difference between the overall disclosure rates of academic staff members and those of professors. As the present graph shows, disability disclosure varies among academic staff at different levels, with the rate of disability disclosure by professors increasing slower than that of academic staff members within the last decade. Moreover, still the proportion of professors that disclose as disabled is lower than the proportion of disabled academic staff. This is 3.2% for professors compared to 4.6% for academic staff in general. Focusing again on professors, within the last decade, the proportion of disabled academics who are professors decreased by 0.4 percentage points, from 7.5% to 7.1%, whereas the proportion of non-disabled staff who are professors increased by 1.6 percentage points, from 8.0% to 10.4%. This means that although the initial difference between the proportion of disabled and non-disabled staff who are professors was at 1.3 percentage points, this grew even bigger and has now reached a 3.3 percentage point difference. This graph presents the most common impairment types disclosed among students and staff members declaring a disability. We see that these vary across the two populations, with long-lasting illness or health condition being the impairment type mostly disclosed by staff members at 23.8%, whereas specific learning difficulties are the most disclosed impairment type among students at 33.4%. It is worth mentioning that the share of both staff and students who disclose the mental health condition has risen since last year, which might be related to COVID and its well-documented severe effects on well-being. Nearly twice as many female academic staff members disclose a mental health condition as male academics, with 65.3% of female academics disclosing one, compared to 34.7% of male academics. This is an example of how an intersectional approach might shed light on disability issues. It is also worth considering how this difference might relate to gender inequities faced by female academics, who, for example, tend to be employed in more precarious contracts, are less well paid compared to their male colleagues, and have to balance their work alongside caring responsibilities more frequently. Looking at academic staff member salaries, this slide shows that a lower proportion of disabled academics are on the highest baseline compared to non-disabled academics. Being exact, while 36.6% of non-disabled academics earn over than £50,000 per year, only 32% of disabled academics do so. This inequity in terms of salaries is not only a feature noted among academic staff members. On the contrary, there is a disability paying gap for all UK higher education staff members when looking at the salaries of academic and professional and support staff combined. As this slide shows, the disability paying gap has mainly been increasing within the last 5 years. Specifically, whereas on average non-disabled staff members earn 7.7% more than their disabled colleagues in 2015-2016, this gap has risen even further, with non-disabled staff members in 2019-2020 earning on average nearly 9.5% more than their disabled colleagues. Finally, looking at the disability awarding gap, this has reduced more so within the last year than in the past. Specifically, whereas between 2010-11 and 2018-19, the awarding gap between non-disabled and disabled qualifiers was in average at around 1.9 percentage points. In 2019-20, this was only at 0.6 percentage points, with 82.2 of first-degree non-disabled qualifiers and 81.6% of disabled qualifiers being awarded with a first or a 2-1 degree. It is important to question why this might have happened and try to interrogate what might have happened within the last year that was different to the previous ones. Thinking, for example, about the non-detriment policies and remote assessment practices adopted by institutions due to COVID, and how this might have impacted disabled students' attainment. Closing the disability awarding gap is important because degree awards are closely linked to career outcomes. HISA's data indeed show that there is a disability gap in graduate outcomes, as more disabled students who qualified in 2018-19 were unemployed than their non-disabled peers, with 8% compared to 6.2% respectively, and a smaller share were in full-time work, with 20.4% compared to 18.9% respectively. So that brings me to the end of my whistle-stop tour of our key disability-related findings from our annual Staff and Student Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Statistical Reports. In the next few slides, I will present you with an overview of data related to disabled staff and students from other research we conduct at Advance HE. This includes our work with the Disability Student Commission, our latest postgraduate experience survey, as well as a survey exploring the experiences of academic staff during COVID. Data will also be presented from a virtual event I facilitated back in November with another colleague, bringing together disabled staff and students to discuss how we can further disability equality in UK higher education. Starting with data collected as part of Advance HE's involvement with the Disabled Students Commission, between May and August 2021, an online survey and 8 focus groups were conducted to explore the perceptions and experiences of disabled students during the COVID-19 pandemic. The main areas explored were access and transition to higher education, experiences of remote learning, employability, mental health and well-being, as well as support from universities during the pandemic. The full report can be accessed via Advance HE's webpage, but I will present you with some key findings within the next few slides. In terms of experiences of remote learning, nearly 65% of the respondents found adapting to online learning difficult, whereas only 47% responded the same for adopting to online assessment. However, experiences of remote learning, teaching and assessment varied firstly by impairment type. For example, a higher proportion of students with a learning difference, such as dyslexia, dyspraxia or ADHD, found adopting to the remote learning and teaching experience very difficult, 47.3% compared to 36.3%. Secondly, experiences varied by ethnicity as well, with Black, Asian and minority ethnic disabled students finding adapting to online learning and teaching harder compared to the total sample, with 41.2% compared to 36.3%. In general, the majority of students supported the move towards hybrid learning and were in favour of continuing the flexibility around the assessment formats, even after the end of the pandemic. The mental health and well-being of disabled students appear to be significantly impacted by the pandemic, with survey results from the Disabled Students Commission survey and the 2021 Advance HE's Postgraduate Taught Experience survey raising concerns around this topic. Specifically, in the DSC survey, almost 83% of the participants reported feelings of isolation and/or loneliness as a result of COVID. Nearly 88% of the respondents with a reported mental health condition said that COVID had exacerbated their health and well-being. Similarly, mental and emotional health issues were the most cited reason for master's students on in-person courses to consider dropping out, as found in the 2021 Advanced AG's Postgraduate Taught Experience Survey. In 2021, just 58% of those who had declared a mental health condition felt their health and well-being support met their requirements, in comparison to 70% of non-disabled master students. Disabled staff also faced significant challenges during the pandemic, similarly to disabled students. In an online survey carried out by Advanced HE between October and December 2020, with 1,310 participants from UK higher education institutions, 16.1% of those respondents identifying as disabled strongly disagreed that their institutions did all they could to support staff during this time, compared to 8.3% of non-disabled respondents. Moreover, 16.8% of the respondents said that they needed access to assistive technology while working from home, but did not have it. The timings of the survey suggest that this meant staff did not have reasonable adjustments in place for 6 to 9 months. The full report based on the survey's findings can be accessed in Advanced AG's webpage, and I have included the relevant hyperlink in this slide. So, what do disabled staff and students have to say in terms of how can higher education become a more equitable and inclusive space for them? This is what we explored in an online event myself and another colleague facilitated in November, featuring both disabled staff and students' perspectives. Based on the discussions developed during this event, we summarized disabled staff and student suggestions in a blog, and the main takeaway messages is what I have included in this final slide. So, disabled staff and students said that furthering disability equality should be a collective responsibility and not one that disproportionately falls on the shoulders of disabled staff and students only. Moreover, they advocated for the need to retain flexibility in terms of access, teaching and learning, and assessment post-pandemic, requiring from their institutions to provide them with clear timelines on the implementation of reasonable adjustments. Furthermore, they raised the need for improving the accessibility and quality of online resources, as well as the need to celebrate disabled staff and students, sharing and promoting the value they bring in higher education. Finally, it was clear that both disabled staff and students wanted disabled people to be actively involved in knowledge share, co-production and co-creation of disability-relevant initiatives. One of the staff participants aptly described this using the slogan, "Nothing about us without us," which I think perfectly captures the need to bring disabled staff and students' voices at the forefront. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope you found my presentation interesting. Please do not hesitate to get in touch with me for any questions or follow-up conversations using my email address on this slide, pany.sotiropoulou@advance-he.ac.uk. Please also follow Advanced HE's work by keeping an eye out on our webpage at www.advance-he.ac.uk to stay up to date with all the work we are doing with the Disabled Students Commission and other relevant initiatives. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you once again.